Good morning, Saints. One of the subjects that I've been doing a lot of thinking about, and I think most people have probably been doing a lot of thinking about, is answering the question why. I guess that's a pretty naturally human thing to do. We do it at very young ages when we're kids, or if you've had kids, you tell them we're going to do this, that, or the other thing, and very often the question is why. Well, we're not immune to that question when we grow up and become adults. We have just as much of a propensity to ask God why as our kids have to ask us why. And it's a big question with this virus, with this pandemic that's sweeping around the globe and has affected so many of our lives. There definitely is a temptation to ask God why. And I don't think that asking in and of itself is necessarily wrong. One of the books that I keep coming back to is the little book of Habakkuk in the Minor Prophets, where we kind of we get a little bit of a peek behind the curtain of Providence, if you will, and God shows us a little bit of the why and the what that is going on behind the scenes, and it's a helpful book, I think, for us. Habakkuk opens in the first 4 verses with Habakkuk's complaint, is how the ESV heads it, but he basically doesn't like how God is running things, and he's going to tell him about it. Bold, bordering on a little bit dangerous as far as attitude goes. I don't think that asking God why he's doing something or why he's allowing something is necessarily wrong, but certainly insinuating that God himself might be wrong for allowing it, or that you're somehow accusing him. That's a whole different thing, and Habakkuk is definitely doing that. God answers him, which he didn't have to, but God answers him in verse 5, and says, "Look, if I was to tell you what I was doing, you wouldn't believe it." And then he goes on to explain what he's doing. That he's raising up the Babylonians. He's going to use this evil nation state of Babylon to judge his people, who have been walking away from him for a long time. Habakkuk, of course, doesn't like that answer, and it's sort of, it's what God said in verse 5. Look, if I was to tell you, you wouldn't believe it anyway, but here you go. And then, of course, Habakkuk can't believe it, just like God said, and he basically says, like, look, they're worse than us. We're God's people, and yeah, it's a mess right now, but the Babylonians are much worse than we are, and so how could you possibly favor them over us? And very arrogantly, and after he makes the second complaint in chapter 2, verse 1, he says, "I will take my stand at my watchpost and station myself on the tower and look out to see what he will say to me and what I will answer concerning my complaint." And you sort of see Habakkuk with his hands on his hips, gotcha. He thinks that he's sort of trapped God or something, and of course he hasn't done this. And God responds by saying, "And the Lord answered me, and he said, write the vision, make it plain on tablets, so that he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its appointed time. If it seems slow, wait for it. It will surely come. It will not delay. Behold, his soul is puffed up. It is not upright within him, but the righteous shall live by faith." And what God is telling Habakkuk is that, look, you are very finite. Sometimes when God does things, especially with nations, God might be accomplishing a purpose of his over a period of 1 or 2 or 300 years. We're adults for a few decades, living in the midst of this period of centuries. There's no way that we have the capacity with the little tiny sliver of what we can see to understand the big picture of what God is doing. He's saying, look, my wisdom and my oversight and my governance is so much larger than your perception that you're not capable of understanding and seeing what I'm doing here. And that's a good reminder to us, right? We've all experienced that as parents. Like, we tell our kids to do things they don't like, right? Eat your broccoli, do your chores. but why? I don't like this. I don't see how this is good for me. Well, yeah, they're 2 or 3 or 4 years old. They can't see where this is going. They can't see what this is trying to accomplish. Well, it's no different with us. In fact, the gap between us as parents from our 2 or 3 year old is tiny compared to the gap between the Almighty, all-wise God and us, even the most mature among us. And he says, the righteous shall live by faith. It's the answer. It's one of the most important verses in the Bible. That verse is quoted in Romans, Galatians, and Hebrews. Much of the New Testament kind of extrapolates off this principle. But look, when our circumstances are bad and painful and we hurt, it may tempt us to think that God doesn't see, but he sees. It may tempt us to think that God isn't good, but he is good. And it may also tempt us to think that, if God sees and if he's good, then why isn't he willing to act? Well, God is always acting, but we don't always have the capacity to see what he's doing. And so when life hurts, whether it's a foreign nation in the book of Habakkuk being used as an instrument of judgment, or whether it's this virus that is sweeping around the world. Why did God allow COVID-19 to do what it's doing right now? I don't know. I mean, I can list 4 or 5 reasons from Scripture that would adequately explain possibilities, but I can't know. He hasn't revealed that to us. And anybody else that tells you that they know doesn't know. They're guessing. They're making educated guesses, hopefully. But Habakkuk, it ends. Kind of never gets resolved. But Habakkuk says something very poetic at the end. He says, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no food, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls. Right? That's an ancient Near Eastern way of saying, look, if my 401k falls apart, if I lose my job, if I spend all my savings, right? If I lose everything that I have, if there's nothing else that I can rely on in this world to sustain me, verse 3:18, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God the Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's, and he makes me tread on my high places. Right? God is enough. God is enough.